Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Kearns, your professor for the Disaster Management Program, and today we want to talk about tornadoes, microburst, and derechos. So let's start out with an example, and this is one that I have a lot of personal experience with. We'll include kind of the basics of what happened. The example will be the outbreak of the spring tornadoes in 2011. I'll include a briefing that I developed during a disaster in Georgia, and then we'll also look at a mitigation report. So let's start out with what is a tornado. A tornado is produced when there's a collision of warm and cold air masses, and then a column of air rotating connects the surface of the Earth to a cumulonimbus cloud. That typically is the basic definition of what is a tornado, and then we rate the intensity of a tornado based on the enhanced Fujita scale, more commonly referred to as EF, and then we score it with in EF0 being the least intense and the EF5 being the most intense. And just in terms of words, the plural of tornado is tornadoes. And then OS or OES, both spellings are correct. And OES is a little bit more commonly spelled today, but again, both are correct. Tornado itself has a Spanish origin, and it's a blend of the word for thunderstorm, which is tronada, and the word to turn, which is tornar. So this is just kind of a graphical representation showing you how the cool air and the warm air masses collide, cooling of the Pacific and warming of the Gulf waters create this kind of mix and create what we typically refer to as Tornado Alley, which is an area typically just north of the coastal area of the Gulf Coast, and then up into the Midwest and over to the Atlantic seaboard. This is just another example of a tornado. Again, how we have ascending air and descending air, and how that creates this, again, kind of a counterclockwise rotation, and leads to what can be a truly catastrophic type of event. So before I get any further into talking about types of damage associated with a tornado, I also want to talk about two other types of wind-related damage that we see in the context of a thunderstorm that sometimes we confuse with a tornado, but it's not. The first one is a microburst. It's a localized column of air that sinks very quickly and typically is in one particular area. Another way to think about this is it starts with a thunderstorm development. As it builds up weight with water droplets and hailstones, that is suspended by the updraft. After a point, the collection point of this weight overwhelms the ability of the thunderstorm the updraft to hold that weight in place. It can no longer hold that core. It drops down very rapidly and very dangerously. And as it hits the ground, it moves out in all directions. But again, this is referred to as a microburst. Sometimes we talk about it in the context of, well, we think it was a tornado. It sounded like a tornado. The best way to And it can be just as devastating and just as destructive as a tornado. The difference is we're going to see long lines of damage of where the tornado touched down along the way. We typically don't see that. Well, you won't see that with a microburst. With a microburst, your damage is typically confined in one area. And actually, if you can pinpoint the location of where the epicenter was, of where the microburst came down, you're going to have a 360 wave of energy that created damage out from where the epicenter of the microburst came down to the ground. So the other thunderstorm-related damage that we'll talk about in the context of tornadoes, microburst, and our third one is a derecho. The biggest difference between a derecho and anything else that we've talked about is a derecho is this long line of damaging thunderstorms that produces dramatic forward speed of wind with a large swath of damage. If the span of the area is greater than 240 miles and the wind gusts are greater than 58 miles per hour in the storm's path, this is commonly referred to as a derecho. And again, we have a Spanish word origin. It's an adjective for the word straight. But the whole point to a derecho is where we see damage associated with a derecho, it really can span a significant area. In your reading for this week, I did include a paper that we wrote about a derecho that impacted primarily the state of West Virginia in 2012. And it's, you know, it does remind, so I first of all have to confess, I really didn't know what a derecho was at that time. We managed the data for the EMS system when I worked at the University of North Carolina for several states, and that included West Virginia. And as we were meeting with the officials in West Virginia, they were telling us about this really unique storm they had had that at one point had left more than half of the state without power and water, lost a lot of telephone service, created a really profound effect on the infrastructure for an extended period of time. It's commonly referred to as a southwestern hurricane, not commonly, but more colloquially referred to in that manner. But the whole point is it's something over land, and it's not caused by, you know, what we typically think of as a hurricane, but it does create a very large path of damage and may sustain itself for an extended period of time. And that was certainly the case in this. I would encourage you to read the paper that I posted. It does give you an idea of just the magnitude of the damage and the intensity of the storm. So now let's get back to tornadoes. Tornadoes are primarily this, although we have talked about a microburst and we have talked about a derecho. Derecho is rare. Microbursts are fairly common, but the damage, the amount of damage that we see is really limited to just the point of impact of where the microburst, of where the cloud was no longer able to suspend the weight of the rain and the hail. And so again, you have this kind of burst of air and a wave of energy, but it's in a small confined area. With tornadoes, we see tornadoes really touch down and move over several different places, and in some cases wipe out entire towns or communities. You won't see that with a microburst. You could see that with a derecho, but again, it's really rare. With a tornado, you're talking about circular activity, and at the point of where the tornado touches down, really profound damage. This is just a look at F3, F4, and F5 tornadoes between the year 1950 and 1998. So it really gives you an idea, and rightfully so, that the area typically south of Interstate 10 is relatively immune to being exposed to tornadoes. Again, an EF0, an EF1, and EF2 have occurred. They're somewhat rare, but they do occur from time to time. The more you get into the heartland of Louisiana, Mississippi, northern Alabama, until you get over to what really is the Appalachian Mountains, you have kind of the swath of area that's exposed to the conditions that are more favorable to tornadic activity. And we typically see tornadoes and tornadic activity in the spring. So our last slide looked at F3, F4, and F5 tornadoes and a cumulative total. This looks at all tornado activity, and it's from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and it's giving us a number of tornadoes per 1,000 square miles. And what it really does is helps us hone in on those areas that are at greatest risk for tornado outbreak. Again, it basically tells us everywhere east of the Rocky Mountains has some risk. Areas that are more in what's called the plains of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri are at greater risk. So now I want to spend a little bit of time looking at what over the past 50 years was the most profound outbreak of tornadoes that we've seen in the U.S. Now this period of time is looking at April 1st of 2011 to April 30th, and actually, although this is only looking at that 30-day window, tornado season in this particular really profound series of tornadoes that we saw in April, we saw extend into May of 2011. And I've got some firsthand experiences from my response to the tornado outbreak in one particular state, and that was the state of Georgia. And I'll go over some of those details here in just a minute. So this is kind of a timeline. Again, the first window of tornadoes we saw April 4th through the 5th. We saw a second wave of tornadoes that were North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, April 8th through the 11th. I think I've included, I did a presentation at a state conference in North Carolina about the tornado outbreak in North Carolina, April 8th through the 11th. And then moving forward, April 14th through the 16th, again, Georgia, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas, and then April 19th through the 24th, 130 tornadoes. April 26th through the 28th was really that most profound time, 321 deaths, and then May 22nd through the 27th, 177 deaths. So basically, over a 2-month period of time, we had a greater outbreak of tornadoes than at any time over the last 75 years. This was truly a catastrophic moment, not so much a moment, a catastrophic period in terms of what we dealt with tornadoes and in terms of how we pushed resources out. We as in state government, state response agencies, and the federal government pushing out response and response services in the aftermath of these types of disasters. Tornado deaths in the United States, again, if you look the peak, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1950s, and to a lesser extent in the 1970s, 2011 was really that anomaly. The big difference between the 1920s and what we see today, construction code requirements are so much better. I won't say that everything is built to such a standard that we won't have deaths today, but we're a lot less likely to have them today than we did 100 years ago. Just again, in the context of where you can take shelter and what you can do to protect yourself. We have a lot more of those options today than we did in the 1920s, the 1930s. So the next couple of slides, I want to go over what I call the Georgia example. This was my last full-time deployment to a disaster zone, working in operations for FEMA. And this is an operational briefing that I gave from June the 2nd of 2011. So understand that we quantify disasters. There's a numerical number assigned. Even though this particular outbreak of tornadoes affected the state of Tennessee, the state of Alabama, in a fairly profound way, each state has a disaster declaration based on the damage that occurred in that particular state. So DR 1973 GA basically means it's a disaster declaration. 1973 is the number that was assigned to it. GA indicates it was in Georgia. There are 130, so approximately 130 counties in Georgia. The ones I have highlighted are the ones that had the greatest amount of damage, and the ones that were approved for. We'll approve an area for one or both programs. One program is called PA, Public Assistance. The other program is IA, Individual Assistance. PA is basically damage to infrastructure, highways, public safety type of support. IA is damage to homes and individual losses. So let's talk a little bit. So for the next three slides, I want to go over individual assistance, public assistance, and mitigation assistance. And each county can be approved for one, both, or all three. It really depends on the magnitude of the damage in that particular area. The best way to think about the needs for individual assistance is how much has impacted homes where people live, how much have they lost. So that's an IA assessment. A PA assessment is schools, public works, roads, infrastructure, traffic lights, things like that. And then mitigation is what communities qualify for additional funds to help them rebuild in a more in a way that at least allows them to be able to continue to provide the services that they provide. And so this is PA assistance, and actually if you look back on the previous slide, you'll see that not all communities that were approved for PA were also approved for IA. Again, it depends on how much damage has occurred. In this particular case, PA may include also debris removal, but you know how much damage has occurred to schools, and I'll show you some damage to municipal buildings and schools in just a minute that was a part of this assessment. And then mitigation, with mitigation, so short-term recovery and long-term recovery. Mitigation is really an extension of that long-term recovery. So short-term recovery is really about reopening the roads, as an example, getting emergency lighting working again, getting the utilities working the way they're supposed to. It's basically restoring those essential services and getting things working the way they're supposed to work. Long-term recovery is really about, in a more residual way, how can we help support the local government and the state government to build back stronger and build back better and in a more resilient way, so that if there is damage in the future, if there's a similar exposure in the future, there's a greater chance of surviving the damage and the structure being able to continue to be used. So again, my assignment was only the state of Georgia, but during the time that we were in the state of Georgia, there were states around us that had storms either just before or just after us. Alabama had several storms just before us, but if you remember the tornadoes that struck Tuscaloosa close to and actually parts of the University of Alabama, that occurred just after us. Our incident management team from that FEMA had assigned to us there at Georgia were redeployed to the state of Alabama to help in the aftermath of the series of tornadoes that came through there. But all of this occurred in the August and May window of 2011. So this is Tuscaloosa, April 27, 2011. Again, this gives you an idea of what a tornado looks like. People will tell you it sounds like a train. There's this really loud rumbling that goes on, and it's truly profound. If you're ever around one, you'll remember it. Hopefully, you'll be able to take shelter and protect yourself. But it's certainly a potentially life-threatening situation. Just another. The size and scope of this particular tornado was really dramatic. Most tornadoes aren't quite as large at the contact point with the surface of the earth. And when you see those that have a large footprint, so to speak, or contact point with the surface of the earth, the amount of damage can be really widespread. And then again, depending on how far the swath is. This is an example of Pratt City near Birmingham. Just a really profound amount of damage that took place across this particular community. As you can tell, just to be able to get resources in, to be able to help these people, to help facilitate search and rescue, you've got to be able to reopen the roads just so responders can get through these areas. So when we talk about emergency debris removal, being a part of that initial response, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about just trying to be able to get responders into the area to help them be able to find people that may still be trapped under this debris. Again, just more pictures from this particular area, but again, just giving you an idea of the magnitude of the damage. Pleasant Grove, Alabama. I think I've got some images from a Wrangler jean factory that was in the area. So this is the field assessment briefing in the aftermath of the tornadoes. Ringgold, Georgia is actually one of those places I spent a little bit of time, although I was primarily working in operations, which meant I stayed mostly in Atlanta. I did go to Ringgold one day as a part of a damage assessment team. And in this, when we talk about mitigation assessment teams, we're talking about not just looking at what happened, but how do you make recommendations to for long-term recovery, to build back in a way so that you're not as at risk. Our first concern is always loss of life. So how do we build back better to avoid loss of life in the future? And then structural integrity, maintaining the structure in a way that recovery becomes a less expensive task in the aftermath of a storm. There'll always be debris removal. That's not the big concern. The big concern is protecting the people and keeping the structure intact. This is Smithfield, Mississippi. Again, just a series of tornadoes that came through between April and May of 2011 were really profound. Pleasant Grove, Alabama, just outside of Birmingham. 4 deaths in this particular area. The main things that you see here is not so much what you do see, it's what you don't see. The places, if you look closely, you'll see foundations, but what you'll also see is the lack of any intact structure. Once we get into the F3, F4 type of tornado damage, the amount of force that places on a residential structure is profound. The potential survivability of the structure becomes less and less, again, when you're in the EF4, EF5 range. So that's why we're looking at what are other things we can do. And I'll talk about that in just a minute with safe rooms and what that means. So one key objective is, again, engineering, being sure that we look at root cause analysis. What caused the structure to collapse? What are ways that structures can be built? What are recommendations that can be made so that it's more survivable in the future? And then again, training and outreach. How do we teach people? One of the places that we'll set up teams to advise people on, again, just really basic things that are important in construction and repair. We typically sent teams to Ace Hardware, Home Depot, and Lowe's. Again, just here's basic things that you need to know as a part of your rebuilding efforts. So, the benefits of these studies are to forensically look at, from an engineering standpoint, what happened, and then how do we, are there changes that need to be made to building codes? Are there things that we need to do to be sure that we're creating a more resilient area? We can't just tell everybody who lives in a tornado-prone area, you just have to move, because honestly, that's millions and millions of people. And the risk is relative. There are plenty of instances where a tornado may affect one house and one street over doesn't affect any house in that neighborhood. But again, back to the house that impacted, all of the houses on that street were taken out. It's very small, very confined, but quite catastrophic in the places that it does come in contact with. And so if we know people have to live in these areas, or people are going to want to live in these areas, what are things that we can do from a building code standpoint, and what are recommendations we can make so that we can build back safer and in a more resilient way? Again, the aim is to protect the people, and hopefully much of the structure is able to survive the impact. So I like this graphic just because it gives you an idea of the path and the swath of a tornado. And that's not exactly drawn to scale. So, but the important point is this gives you an idea of how those tornadoes moved across the state of Alabama in late April of 2011. Again, if it was a microburst, the microburst would only come down in one impacted area, may damage a couple of houses in the neighborhood, but once you identify that impact point, you're going to see in a 360-degree way damage. If you're standing in the center, you'll be able to see damage all around you of where the microburst occurred. With a tornado, you're going to have this long line of damage of where, as long as the tornado is contacting the ground, once it makes touchdown and continues to move on its path, you'll see this ongoing kind of path of destruction, so to speak. Again, the whole point to this is what type of advisories, what type of training opportunities, and what type of educational opportunities. Other things it does is it informs what are ways that we can fund, when thinking from a FEMA standpoint, what are things that can be done to fund the creation of safe rooms and the creation of creating safe shelters for a community that's more prone to or more vulnerable to these types of disasters. And then critical and essential facility performance. What I'm talking about there is, the Emergency Operations Center for each county is a place that all communications takes place. We need to be able to protect that. The fire departments, we need to be able to protect the stations that where the first responders, where fire trucks are housed, EMS stations. There are critical assets we need to protect, schools we need to protect. And so one of the aftermath outcomes of being able to do an assessment like this is to also look for ways that we can identify what are things we can do when we build back to harden this facility so that if it does happen in this community again, and it does impact this building again, it doesn't impact the building in the same way, and it doesn't hurt people within the building. This is one particular volunteer fire department in Webster Chapel, Alabama. Again, just a reminder of that fire truck and that fire station is not going to be able to help anybody. So if we can't harden our stations in a way that they can protect the equipment in the building and protect the people in the building, those people and that equipment can't help anyone. This is an example of a fire station in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It was a relatively new station. It did not have a safe room. There was some roof damage and some structural damage, but it did not collapse down on the equipment. And so the people in the building were safe and the equipment was able to respond. But one weakness that we saw, there was not an immediate impact of this building, and there was no safe room in the building, and it was recommended that a safe room be constructed. This is an example of a what's called a FEMA compliant emergency operations center. This is a hardened facility. This is also considered, this roof is considered a survivable roof. It would hold up very well if impacted by high winds, and would hold up very well in terms of being resilient and capable of protecting the people inside and continuing to perform its essential mission during the peak of the storm, even if the storm directly impacted this structure. This is another emergency operations center, city of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You've got a complete roof collapse on the second floor. And it does remind you once again, they can't help you if they can't be protected. And we're talking about public safety and public works. Another part of the building. Other aspects that we also have to think about, these towers that we use to connect communication systems, what are ways we can make them more resilient? It's very difficult to design a tower that's going to withstand the types of wind speeds that we'll see with certain types of tornadoes. School performance, you know, the thing that I was really surprised most to see, and I talked about spending a day in Ringgold, Georgia, the amount of damage to the school was really profound. And older codes that influenced how schools were built in the 1980s and 1990s just really didn't meet the standard of what would have been needed. Certainly, you know, none of the schools, at least the schools that I saw, had a safe room. In terms of what their typical safety plan called for, was to move to a hallway. I'll show you in just a minute that wouldn't have necessarily made a lot of difference. As you can tell, but this particular middle school, the entire roof was stripped away. Parts of the brick and block wall were torn down. This is in the aftermath of the windows being boarded up. But this school performance, there was substantial roof damage. Most of the windows were blown out. It just reminds you that the structure of this building was not designed to withstand the type of storm that moved over that area. It just so happened this particular day, the kids were not at school. I'm not sure if they had canceled school because of the weather forecast, or if it was this would have been late April, so I'm not sure if they would have canceled school for the weather forecast. I can't imagine that they would have been out of school that early. But for whatever, I don't know the point. I just know that they weren't in school at the time. And based on our walkthrough of the school, that was probably fortunate for a number of kids. Again, just shows you the sports buildings, the gym in one particular place. And I don't remember exactly what the other building was, but this was a part of their sports facility at the high school. This was an elementary school in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I did not go to this particular school, but again, it gives you an idea of how much debris was blown around and how much debris was created. And this particular picture takes me back to that school that I did tour. If you send students, and the common plan is to send students into the hallway, and that's typically the safest area, but that assumes the construction is such that the roof will remain intact and the walls are built to such standards, at least the interior walls are built to such standards that they won't collapse. In this particular case, you can see the sky. The roof was completely peeled away, and the amount of wind damage that in this particular place they had clearly cleaned up after the storm had come through. But it also gives you an idea of just how much risk and exposure would have taken place for the kids had they been evacuated to the hall. What we really saw was new and old facilities had some damage. The newer construction, there were some code compliance issues. Again, that's outside of my area of expertise. I'm just repeating what the engineers were saying. And then the older buildings were poorly engineered to be able to withstand the type of impact that a tornado and the type of risk a tornado poses. This is the commercial building that I mentioned earlier in Hacklesburg, Alabama. Again, this was a very large, if I'm not mistaken, 500,000 to 700,000 square foot of space where they made Wrangler jeans. Just understand that in the hours before the tornadoes came through this particular area, they ordered a work stoppage. Fortunately, somebody was on the ball at this particular plant. They're working in this basically a metal prefab shell building. That'll protect you from the rain and the wind. Well, it'll protect you from the rain. It won't protect you from any substantial wind. These metal shell prefab buildings are typically inexpensive and really economical ways to do something like this. Just understand that they're not designed to withstand any type of significant impact such as this. So of the 150 employees, most everybody had gone home by the time the tornado struck the building. Only 13 were still in the building at the time, and of the 13 that were in the building, 1 died. You know, if you are in one of those buildings, and I'm talking about like a big box store like Walmart, it's got a brick and block facade to the front of it. But it's basically a substantial, large metal building. You need to find a safe place. Safe place is a place where there's walls around you. Bathrooms in the inside of the building are a safer place. If you're out in the middle of everything and you're trying to find a place to go to and you've got 10 seconds to find a place to go to, find a clothes rack and get under the clothes. That'll at least create some cushion for where you are. Ideally, if you know that's what the weather forecast is, I would put off going to Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart or Target, one of the big box stores. If there's a direct impact involving a tornado at any of these big box commercial built stores, there's typically very few engineered, designed safe spaces within those buildings should a tornado impact that area at the time you're there. And this is just another example of commercial buildings. Again, commercial buildings typically aren't designed to withstand this type of weather. If you're in a building like this, you want to be in the away from the wall, away from glass, in a smaller area, hopefully that's been reinforced. Typically, the bathrooms are some of the better built areas, but I would rely on whoever is doing your evacuation plan for a building to tell you where the safe places are. That's just a kind of an off-the-cuff remark based on my experience seeing some of these other buildings. But each building should have a designated safe space. In fact, today, if you're in most larger buildings, you'll see tornado shelters, signage pointing you to what is some safer places in the building. Again, just another commercial building. And the whole point of this is there was a piece of tube steel on the front porch column of a house that was, again, pulled completely off of the house and impaled in the hillside. The amount of force involved in any of these types of disasters really profound, and it's certainly important to think in the context of where do you go, where do you hide, how do you keep yourself safe. And this is the Hobby Lobby at Tuscaloosa. I didn't include a Hobby Lobby when I was talking about Walmart and Target and Lowe's and Home Depot. Just understand any big box store is not a safe place for you to be. If you're in one of those places when something strikes, find a smaller room that you can get to in the middle of the building. If all else fails, find an area where there's a lot of things that are soft that you can hide under. Clothing section is one of those places. Residential building performance. So just a brief look at some of the residential buildings. Again, newer construction typically fared better. Older construction had little or no engineering. It's something called brittle failures, which basically means if it fails in a pretty dramatic way. And I'll go through a couple of the examples of this. This particular house, the weakest link was actually believed to be where the garage door failed, and then the wind penetrated the house there and what's considered blew the top off of the roof. I didn't see this particular house when I was in Ringgold, but again, this was one of the examples that was used in the MAT report. These are two other houses that were used in the MAT report, same neighborhood. The difference is one house was strictly code compliant. The other house either was based on older codes or would not reflect current code today. But again, these two houses were in the same neighborhood. You can see the difference though between one that was built that was more code compliant than the other. And then failure of the sill plate. I'm not an engineer. I don't pretend to be one, but as I heard the presentation a number of times, build a good foundation, anchor the house to the foundation, build good walls, and anchor the roof to the walls, and build a good roof. If you have a stable roof, the roof is connected in multiple points to the walls. The walls are connected in multiple points to the sill plate, and you've got a good solid foundation. You have a lot more likelihood of survival. And then we'll talk about specific places within the building here in just a minute. Refuge areas in residential buildings. If you're going to be if you're going to live in some of these areas that are more prone to, again, these greater intensity winds, the recommendation is that you have something called a safe room, and that can be one of two areas. It can be an area that's partially in the ground, such as a basement, or if you're going to build on a slab, which is a concrete surface that rests at or above the level of the ground, that you build an interconnected survival shelter or something called a safe room. You can really turn a storage room, you can build a storage room purposefully as a safe room. We have a standard called FEMA 3020 compliant. It's just a construction standard on how to build a safe room, and how you create, how you put hinges on it, locking mechanism to be sure that the door stays closed and that the walls and the area over top of the walls are intact and the walls are well anchored to the foundation of the property. Sheltering in safe rooms, one of the main things that we saw with this is a FEMA-funded safe room in Brookside, Alabama. Um, there were 150 people that came to this particular building during the storm. These are some safe rooms that were full of people during the time of the tornado. These are fairly common today on playgrounds and at athletic events in at least some of the cities in the aftermath of tornadoes. And if you look closely at the door, you'll see a locking mechanism at the top and at the bottom, as well as in the center. And the point is, you want a commercial grade hinge on one side, and you want deadbolt locks on the other side. You want to be sure that door stays completely closed, because there will be a substantial vacuum pulled against it if the tornado passes over top of it, and will pull that door open and either blow debris in or pull people out. You want the door closed, you want the walls intact, you want the roof over top intact. And this is, again, a good example of a safe room. Just another example of a larger, these are called tube safe rooms, but they're built with partially ground protection as well as protection from with the structure itself. These are also residential safe rooms that have been built out in someone's yard, kind of a dome type structure that's been placed into the ground. They're fairly inexpensive, $5,000 to $10,000. It is about being sure that you have someone that can install it correctly and that it's code compliant. But these can be very important ways to be able to survive a tornado, and having these types of safe spaces. This is a safe room that was built as a kind of a storage building, but it's a good above ground safe room. In this particular place, it also meets access and functional needs for someone who is wheelchair bound. But in this particular case, again, if you'll notice, there's 3 distinct locks on the door, top, bottom, and in the middle. This door is an in-swing, but you want to be sure that you can control the door, because that is the weakest point in terms of accessing. As long as the walls and the roof and the foundation are all tied together, and if it's built to code, it is tied together, then the weakest link becomes the door. That's the best way to secure the door. This is another tornado shelter, again, used during a storm. One of the places that we saw several of these in place, and I'm talking about from the report, I didn't see them firsthand, but this came from the engineering report, was people living in communities where there were multiple mobile homes. Having a mobile home is not a safe place for either a microburst or any of these weather phenomena. We're talking about tornadoes, derechos. They're built to be economical. They're not built to be safe in those types of weather events. And so, if you're living in one or visiting someone who's in one, and there's this type of clear and present danger in the immediate forecast, you need to get out of there, and you need to know where's a safe place for you to go. In some of the mobile home parks that we had people that visited, they had safe rooms that had been built into the ground for them, and this is just one of those examples. So this is the web page of information that FEMA has about safe rooms. The main point that I'll make here is in your home, identify where is a safe place in your home. If you live in a house with a basement is typically safer. If you live in New Orleans, there's not a lot of basements. If your home has a second floor, the stairwell under the staircase going up to the second floor is typically the strongest built part of your home. If you have a small room closer to the center of the the home, that is typically a safer place. One thing that I heard at least one of the engineers talk about in terms of things that he saw that made sense that people were doing, they would keep bicycle helmets in what they considered their Alamo, their safe room that they would go to during a tornado, and they would put the helmets on. You know, there's some logic to it in the fact that the most serious injury associated with any type of these types of storms is a head injury that can cause catastrophic injury and death. So it does make sense. I've just not seen any scientific evidence that says conclusively this is what you need to do. But it does make sense, and I certainly think that's a reasonable thing to think about. I will tell you one place that we are not as likely to say that's a great idea. There once was a time we used to talk about, you know, you need to go to the bathtub and pull something over top of you. We've heard stories plenty of times of people talking about taking their kids with them, getting into the bathtub and pulling a mattress over top of them. Just to understand that if the bathtub is in the center of the room or the center of the house, it's far more likely to be safe than if it's on one of the outer walls. The second thing to remember is we used to say that when the bathtub was a cast iron or this really large metal structure that we use to take a bath in. Today, most bathtubs are fiberglass and don't have the same type of structural integrity that an old metal bathtub had. But I would just think in the context of where I live, what's the safest place within where I live. And if you're going to live in one of these areas that's more prone to tornadoes, constructing a safe room, if you're going to live above grade, constructing a safe room is important. It would certainly be an important consideration, or installing a tornado shelter out in the backyard. Again, houses with a basement, have someone give you some opinion over what's the safest place, but being below grade is typically safer than being above grade. And certainly building a safe room is a safer thing to have. And then last but not least, churches and schools are not immune to these types of disasters. So churches and schools should also have identified places for people to go during these types of weather events, because they can strike and they can cause injury and they can cause death. So with that, that takes us to the end for the tornadoes, derechos, and microburst lecture for this week. Certainly, if you have questions, send me an email, or make an appointment. I'll be glad to meet with you either in the office or by Zoom. But it is important to remember the key components of this presentation. It can keep you safe, it can keep your family safe. And certainly from a business continuity standpoint, we want to be able to protect our business so that we can continue to do the things we're doing. Thank you.